I knew this day would come. Unfortunately, it looks like the cost of video games is going to rise in the future, potentially to $80 to $100 American. And I wanted to break this down as someone that has experienced price increases in video games as I live in Canada, and some video games, even Baldur's Gate 3, one of my favorite games of all time, was priced at $93 Canadian. But I'll be covering the state of video gaming in 2025 by Apillion and Matthew Ball's presentation on this. Now, there are some games that are valid to have a higher cost associated with them. And this, I guess, comes down to Grand Theft Auto 6, which a lot of developers are hoping that Grand Theft Auto 6 will cost $80 to $100, which gives them the option of also pricing their game at that price point. This is opening up the floodgates for some very bad stuff, but it raises a lot of questions on the cost of video games to produce. Obviously, Grand Theft Auto 6 costs a lot of money to make, but there's actually some interesting information on this with how expensive it cost Square Enix to make Final Fantasy 16, which ended up costing them more than Red Dead Redemption 2 cost to make, which raises a lot of questions. But I guess bringing it back from 2011 to 2022, or 2021, you can see the cost or the price in video games that people are spending has increased drastically. Annual revenues up 150% overall, which is pretty much unheard of. It was soared up to $200 billion. And this is a huge jump, as you can see, from 2011 to 2021 with 231 billion. And 2011, it was only 111 billion. So that's a 108% increase over 10 years. If you look at the real world GDP, this only increased 32%, with the US real GDP increasing 52%, and Japan unfortunately decreasing, with Japan having a huge market in video gaming. There's actually some very interesting information that I want to break down about how the cost of video games are actually cheaper today than they've ever been when you factor in inflation. So you can see here, this is the anticipated growth that companies had, with ARC being, I don't know what they were thinking with thinking their growth would be that high, but yeah, there's a lot of projections, and things obviously didn't pan out that way during the pandemic. So you can see here in 2023, 2024, the amount of money spent on video games kind of stalled. This is the first time in history that video games did not increase year on year. And a lot of companies, you can see, were projecting that they would increase largely. ARC obviously missed their mark by quite a bit. And this is tough because there's been a lot of fantastic games that released in the last few years, not to mention things like Baldur's Gate 3, Spider-Man 2, Alan Wake 2, Cyberpunk's Phantom Liberty, Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, Hi-Fi Rush, and so many amazing games here that I had a lot of fun with. And I think this has been some of the best years in gaming that we've ever gotten. I think 2023 might be one of the best games ever, or best years ever in terms of gaming. But yeah, despite having some of these fantastic games released in the last few years, it fell short in terms of sales expectations. But if you look at the other metrics, like music records have increased over year on year. Digital video has actually increased quite a bit, and books have gone up, which is nice to see. I think people should read some more. But video games real spend from 2021 to 2024 actually fell a bit, which is the first time that it's ever done that. And you can see here, continuing with the GDP increased, US real GDP increased. Japan's unfortunately kept falling, the currency being a little bit nice right now if you're looking to travel to Japan. But not that the spend is declining, the players are too. Average play time has partially recovered. This mostly because less engaged players stop playing entirely. So the share of US population that regularly plays video games has decreased, and the average weekly video game play hours among US gamers has decreased a little bit. I've seen some doom and gloom articles talking about if this is the death of gaming. I don't think it's enough to sound the alarm just yet, but there's some very real information here that I want to break down. As you can see, there's been a fair share of stinkers when it comes to video games, like Multiversus, X Defiant, which is shutting down after not even a year, Concord, which didn't even last 2 weeks, Suicide Squad, which has literally been on sale for like $4. So there's been a fair share of stinkers. I wouldn't say the Guardians of the Galaxy game was a stinker. That game was amazing. But I played the Avengers game. Boring. Live action should not be put into these things. The Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, not a great game. Definitely a lot of these missed their sales expectations, and you've seen it in the headlines. There's been a lot of companies that had to lay off players or lay off their employees because people just aren't ended up buying their games, which is really sad to see. And looking into VC content in the world has also dropped too. But there's actually something really interesting. I want to jump ahead here and go all the way to the end because there's something pretty interesting I saw on this slide as I was going through this. So game prices have never been lower in real terms though than they are today. A tough problem that to start and worsened by stalled player growth and rising costs. As you can see, the cost of video games in 1979, $40, and then they increased to $50. And around 1989, they increased a little bit further. And in 2000s, the early 2000s, video games started to become priced at $60 around the time of like the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube. And they stayed pretty steady until recently we started to see games coming out at this $70 price tag American. For Canadians, that's like $80 to $90. And that's quite unfortunate. However, this is the real value of those dollars. So when you bought a video game for $40 back in 1979, it was effectively like you were spending $200 of today's currency on that video game. So that's pretty expensive. Can you imagine going out and buying a video game for $200? I'm talking about an increase in price on video games from upwards of $80 to $100, but $200, that's pretty wild. And obviously, as things continued, the price of video games versus real dollars due to inflation started to decrease. And now, for the first time ever, we actually are seeing this come to be very equal with like the amount you'd spend versus the cost of the game. So companies are starting to feel this now because no other major leisure forum has ever seen their product become worth less nearly every single year for decades. It starts the development of every size. So you can see here like Netflix, average concert ticket price, which I'm not even going to get into the how expensive that is. And the movie prices. Movie prices have jumped up quite a bit, as you can see, from the 1980s down to $2 and upwards of $12. And movie ticket prices in Canada, I don't even want to get into. This is the US only. It's cheap to go to the movies there. It's not so much here. In real terms, a $70 GTA 6 would be the cheapest ever Grand Theft Auto. 30% less than its original 2D entries, was 60 to 24% less than GTA 4 and 5. $91 would be the average, which is pretty crazy. If you think of the real dollar with the adjustments here, Grand Theft Auto 5 was actually like in that time's money, like spending a bit over 80 there. So GTA 6, they'll actually be kind of losing money if you look at it from this perspective. So that's interesting. This was at the very end of it, but jumping back into things, gaming's growth was driven by mobile growth, which is a bit concerning. You can see the big jumps here are mostly due to mobile gaming. What do we know about mobile gaming? It's pretty predatory when it comes to its pricing, with a lot of mobile games being time-gated and making you pay money to progress. And that's a big concern. So you can see this is a big market share of video game spend overall. Mobile's taking up a big chunk of that, which is really tough to see. Another thing, the daily hours of TikTok use among all US adults has only risen, and at the lowest was whenever a video game was at its peak of spending. So people are choosing to spend their time elsewhere when it comes to what type of content they enjoy. And the thing is, TikTok hasn't actually reduced the time that people spend on other platforms like Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. So this is just people in general consuming more content from their phones versus actually playing games. We did see some big successes, however, in the last year with Black Myth Wukong, as you can see here in terms of total sales for major AAA titles. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild with over 30 million sold. Black Myth Wukong is doing quite a bit here, with the rest of the world making up a small chunk, but China has purchased a ton of Black Myth Wukong, and this broke sales records and total number of gamers playing at a time. Here's God of War, Elden Ring, Spider-Man 2018, Baldur's Gate 3, and Ghost of Tsushima for reference. It sold like hotcakes. So there are still games that are selling really well. And this kind of brings me back to the point on if it's worthwhile for gaming to increase in price. I personally don't think that games should, as obviously a big consumer of video games, unless they are worth the price tag. So for games like Baldur's Gate 3, I would have gladly paid more for that game. It was perfect. They've put a lot of attention to detail. There was so much to do in that game. And I got hundreds and upon hundreds of hours into the game. So I obviously got my money's worth. However, there's games that have come out that I spent $80 on and I've only played for a few hours and didn't really even enjoy. So with that, Grand Theft Auto 6 is the most anticipated game of all time. I can understand if that game does release at a higher price tag. However, I would be a little bit upset if, Assassin's Creed Ghosts or Assassin's Creed Shadows releases at $100. I wouldn't even consider playing it at that price. So I think for gaming studios, they have to pick and choose their battles. If they think the game is worth that extra price tag, then maybe they should release it at that. Like for Grand Theft Auto 6, definitely. Larian Studios' next game, if they need the extra money, I'd be more than willing to buy the game at an increased price. Elden Ring, there's only a few developers that I feel are worthy of releasing games at an increased price tag and not have anything to lose from it. As if you increase the price again of a Ubisoft game, I might not want to buy it at that price. So it really comes down to the developer, I guess. And in closing, this was really curious to read, so I'll link this in the description if you want to go through this whole report, because there's some really great information here. But this is wild to see just what's happening with gaming in the future of gaming, what's going to happen next. I think we're going to see an increase in price, unfortunately, but I'm just curious your thoughts. Feel free to leave a comment below with whatever you think about this, and I'll see you all in the next video. Hit the subscribe button below if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching.